Why did some Aussie SAS troopers fight without clothes in the jungle? The history of the Australian Special Air Service Regiment, SASR, during the Vietnam War is marked by efficiency, extreme secrecy, and almost mythical tracking skills. Unlike their US counterparts, the stories of these elite Australian commandos often remained quietly within the regiment, adding to their legendary mystique. They were the eyes and ears of the Australian Task Force, specializing in long-range reconnaissance and deep penetration patrols in the dense, hostile jungle of Phuoc Tuy Province. However, among the tales of bravery and endurance, one stands out as both deeply shocking and a testament to their dedication to mission success: the phenomenon known simply as the naked patrols. Imagine the scene: a small patrol of 4 or 5 highly trained soldiers operating kilometers behind enemy lines. Now, strip them of their protective uniforms, their boots, and much of their standard gear. What remains are men covered head to toe in mud and charcoal, armed only with their weapons and essential ammunition, moving through the pitch-black jungle completely naked. This is the question that must be asked. What extreme necessity, what dire strategic imperative, would force highly professional soldiers to discard the very uniform designed to protect them, choosing instead to fight and survive in the harsh Vietnamese jungle with nothing but their skin? This was not an act of madness or desperation, but a calculated, specialized combat technique. The naked patrols were born from the desperate need for absolute silence and the struggle against a relentless natural enemy, the tropical climate. This story details how the Aussie SAS chose a radical form of personal sacrifice, accepting exposure to leeches, insects, and brutal elements to transform themselves into black ghosts, silent, terrifying phantoms whose mere appearance was designed to inflict psychological terror and guarantee the success of critical intelligence gathering missions, often involving the snatching of high-value prisoners. This is the story of pushing human endurance to its ultimate limit. The operational theatre for the Australian SAS in Vietnam was overwhelmingly the unforgiving landscape of the Phuoc Tuy Province, a labyrinth of dense jungle, treacherous high-growth rubber plantations, and sweltering mangrove swamps. While the Viet Cong and NVA forces were their tactical enemies, the true, constant, and insidious threat was the environment itself. For the deep penetration reconnaissance teams of the SAS, this environment quickly became their number one enemy. The relentless monsoon and the unbearable wet SAS patrols often lasted days, sometimes weeks, operating continuously without a break. The sheer volume of water from daily torrential downpours during the monsoon season to wading through flooded streams and lying submerged in rice paddies meant that the standard Australian jungle combat uniform was perpetually saturated. This constant, unrelenting dampness created 2 critical failures that directly threatened the mission and the lives of the troopers: the agony of the rotting skin. The most debilitating physiological threat was the rapid onset of skin conditions, most notoriously tinea fungal infections, commonly known as jungle rot or athlete's foot, but far more severe. Military uniforms, when wet for days on end, chafed constantly against the skin, especially in the groin, armpits, and between the toes. The perpetually warm, moist fabric created a perfect incubator for infectious fungi and bacteria. For the soldiers, this meant agonizing, persistent itching, followed by raw, weeping sores and deep ulcerations. These wounds, though small, were crippling. They made patrolling in silence an impossible task, as every step became a searing pain, distracting the soldier from the primary task of situational awareness. More critically, infections spread rapidly, turning minor cuts into severe, mission-compromising liabilities. The uniform, meant to protect, was literally eating away at the soldier's combat readiness. The sound of betrayal, the swish and the squelch. In Special Forces operations, silence is the ultimate survival tool. The SAS patrols specialized in crawling within meters of enemy encampments to observe, count, and collect intelligence. Any noise could betray their position, turning a low-key reconnaissance mission into a desperate, often fatal, firefight. A soaking wet uniform, however, is inherently loud. Every shift in weight, every slight adjustment of the body, and every step produced a distinct and unmistakable swishing sound as wet canvas rubbed against wet canvas or nylon against skin. Furthermore, the thick, waterlogged fabric, combined with standard webbing and gear, amplified the sound of movement. Even a slow, deliberate crawl through the undergrowth created a squelching noise that travelled surprisingly far in the still night air. The SAS troopers realized they were in a catch-22. They had to move to survive, but moving in wet gear compromised the very essence of their mission stealth. They could try to dry their gear, but that would involve lighting a fire, a death sentence in deep enemy territory. Faced with this insurmountable tactical and physical problem, the SAS commandos were forced to consider a radical, counterintuitive solution, one that defied decades of military doctrine. To eliminate the problem of the wet, noisy uniform, they had to eliminate the uniform itself. This extreme realization set the stage for the birth of the naked patrols. The relentless assault of the tropical environment, detailed in the previous section, had effectively cornered the SAS troopers. They faced a dilemma where the tools of their trade, their uniform, and basic equipment were actively undermining their missions. The deep penetration patrols they undertook were typically assigned objectives demanding the highest degree of stealth, closing in on an enemy base camp, laying ambush lines directly adjacent to a VC route, or, most dangerously, executing a snatch operation to capture a prisoner for critical intelligence. In these specific, high-stakes scenarios, the slightest audible error could mean the immediate annihilation of the four-man team. The noise generated by wet canvas and gear was simply too great a liability. Consequently, the SAS commandos engineered a solution rooted in Spartan necessity and extreme psychological discipline. The tactical decision to shed the uniform and embrace the naked patrol. This radical maneuver was the final, desperate calculation in the ultimate quest for silence. The men would strip down completely, their bodies becoming the raw, unhindered vessels of their deadly trade. The weight and noise of the saturated uniform were instantly eliminated, reducing their acoustic signature to near zero. What remained was only the bare minimum essential for survival and combat, their standard-issue L1A1 self-loading rifle or the M16, a chest webbing or belt holding spare magazines and grenades, a small knife, and often a silenced radio held close. Movement became an agonizingly slow, controlled choreography. To achieve true silence, the soldiers relied on their advanced tracking and jungle movement skills, enhanced by the elimination of clothing friction. They moved predominantly in a low crawl, sometimes belly crawling through muck and dense undergrowth, or even swimming submerged in rivers and rice paddies to bypass sentries and clearings. Every muscle movement, every breath, was moderated and disciplined. This self-imposed reduction of gear had a profound secondary effect. It dramatically reduced the soldier's profile and allowed him to slip through vegetation that would snag and tear at a fully equipped man. When lying motionless, a common requirement meters from an enemy campfire, the absence of bulky, noisy, and waterlogged clothing allowed them to press themselves tighter against the earth, disappearing into the contours of the terrain. The decision to patrol naked required an immense act of mental discipline. It meant deliberately accepting direct, prolonged exposure to every hazard the jungle offered. The painful sting of biting ants, the persistent suck of leeches, the lacerations from thorny vines, and the omnipresent risk of snakes and venomous insects. It was a conscious trade-off. Personal comfort and safety were sacrificed entirely for mission success and the silence that guaranteed survival. In the world of special forces, this was the ultimate expression of commitment, transforming the highly trained SAS trooper from a soldier into a pure, silent predator. The next step was ensuring that this silent form was completely invisible, blending seamlessly with the night itself. With the noisy, cumbersome uniform cast aside, the SAS troopers had achieved the prerequisite of silence. However, silence alone was insufficient. The patrol had to become invisible, especially when executing the final, most dangerous phase of their mission, the close-quarters observation or prisoner snatching. This required turning the exposed human form into a seamless extension of the surrounding darkness. This led to the intense, almost ritualistic practice of full-body blackening, transforming the already silent troopers into the terrifying entities known to historians as black ghosts. The application of pure darkness, The camouflage process went far beyond the standard practice of merely smearing grease paint on the face. For the naked patrols, every square inch of exposed skin had to be covered. The troopers used a mixture of locally sourced materials, the thick, dark, and rich mud from riverbanks and paddy fields, sometimes mixed with charcoal from burnt-out fires, or in a pinch, heavily applied black camouflage cream. This mixture was methodically rubbed onto the entire body, face, neck, torso, arms, legs, and even feet. The resulting coating achieved two critical objectives. Firstly, it eliminated the pale, telltale sheen of human skin, which could reflect even the faintest moonlight or ambient light filtering through the dense canopy. Secondly, the uneven texture of the mud and charcoal coating broke up the distinct human silhouette, allowing the trooper to merge flawlessly with the complex shadows and dense foliage of the jungle floor, emerging from the muck. The act of applying the full-body camouflage often coincided with the final approach to the target area, frequently requiring the men to submerge or crawl through particularly noxious terrain. When an SAS man emerged from a muddy creek bed or a patch of thick, black ooze, he wasn't just camouflaged, he was a spectral vision. He was a creature born of the earth and the night, defined only by the gleam of his rifle and the intense focus in his eyes. This decision, however, underscored the sheer level of physical sacrifice involved. With their skin completely exposed and covered only by a thin layer of mud, the troopers were now hyper-vulnerable. They accepted constant, agonizing bites from mosquitoes, ticks, and ants. They endured the relentless, silent attack of leeches, which would fasten onto their skin unnoticed until mission completion. They pushed through razor-sharp thorns and jagged rocks that would have been shrugged off by a regular uniform. This raw vulnerability was the price of invisibility. The Black Ghosts accepted the physical cost, understanding that their absolute commitment to stealth was the only barrier between life and a catastrophic mission failure. They were no longer conventional soldiers. They had, by necessity and extreme discipline, crossed the threshold into becoming elemental parts of the jungle itself. It was this terrifying, non-human appearance, achieved through mud and silence, that would soon be leveraged as a weapon far more potent than any grenade: psychological warfare. The success of the naked patrols was only partially rooted in the tactical advantages of silence and invisibility. Their true destructive power lay in the terrifying psychological impact they had on the unsuspecting enemy forces. When a soldier operates under the constant stress of potential ambush, the mind is already strained. The appearance of the Black Ghosts was designed to push that strain beyond the breaking point, beyond human conception. For the North Vietnamese Army, NVA, and Viet Cong, VC, soldiers operating in the deep jungle, many of whom were deeply superstitious, the figure that emerged from the shadows was not immediately recognized as a human opponent. The combination of total silence, complete blackness, and the lack of conventional clothing created an image that transcended the concept of a soldier. It appeared as an elemental, unnatural entity, a spectre, a demon, or an angry spirit. The patrols were often at their most effective during Snatch operations, where the goal was to swiftly capture a sentry or a prisoner from a camp's periphery. Imagine a lone VC guard, tired and alert, staring into the impenetrable blackness of the jungle edge. Suddenly, a figure silent, wet, glistening with muck, and utterly naked save for a weapon rises from the ground. There is no sound of approaching boots or rustling fabric, only the silent, terrifying appearance of a creature that should not exist, instilling primitive fear. This visual shock instantly bypassed rational thought and triggered primitive, ingrained fears. In many traditional Vietnamese beliefs, spirits and malevolent forces are associated with the jungle, the night, and often appear in forms that defy the conventional human shape. The Black Ghosts hit this cultural nerve with ruthless precision. When the enemy saw these phantoms, their reaction was often momentary paralysis, fear-induced panic, or a complete collapse of discipline. This split-second hesitation, the time it took the guard to process that this was a physical threat and not a haunting, was the window the SAS needed. It allowed them to close the distance, neutralize the threat silently, and extract the prisoner before any alarm could be raised. In a conflict where warning screams or a single burst of gunfire could mean disaster, The paralysis achieved by psychological terror was a priceless tactical asset. The stories of these terrifying encounters, even if distorted by fear and passed through whispers, began to circulate among the enemy forces. The jungle, already a place of dread and constant threat, was now rumored to harbor unseen, unstoppable spirits of the night. This persistent fear contributed to reduced enemy morale, increased jumpiness among sentries, and a higher propensity for false alarms, ultimately achieving the psychological dominance the SAS sought. The naked patrols were a profound example of how the most terrifying weapons in Vietnam were not always conventional ordnance, but the exploitation of the human mind itself. To truly understand the operational reality of the naked patrols, one must examine a specific mission where this extreme tactic was employed. While operational secrecy means detailed accounts are scarce, certain missions became legendary within the Australian SAS for demonstrating the method's effectiveness, often involving the high-risk, high-reward task of a prisoner snatch. Snatch. The objective: intelligence at any cost. Consider a scenario in the deep jungle of Phuoc Tuy province, around the long high hills, a known stronghold of the Viet Cong. A patrol received intelligence indicating a mid-level commander was briefly situated in a small, well-hidden bunker complex. Capturing this individual would yield invaluable strategic information. The target area was notoriously sensitive, with layered sentry posts and booby traps, requiring an approach that was absolutely silent and undetected. The patrol leader made the inevitable, brutal call. They would go in naked. The approach: becoming the terrain. The four-man team stripped down hours before the final approach, covering themselves in a thick paste of black river, mud, and charcoal. Moving under the cloak of a moonless night and intermittent rainfall, they began their agonizing crawl. Every discarded twig, every passing shadow, every shift in the air was a potential threat. Because they were not constrained by the noisy, bulky equipment, they could utilize movement techniques impossible for fully dressed soldiers, submerging entirely in shallow water obstacles or squeezing through impossibly tight vine thickets without a sound. The critical phase was the final 50 meters. The patrol had to navigate past several sleeping sentries and position themselves directly outside the commander's reinforced bunker. In standard gear, the swish of the uniform would have betrayed them immediately, but as black ghosts, they moved like shadows cast by the forest itself. They used the absolute darkness and the slight background noise of the night jungle, the croaking of frogs, the buzz of insects to cover the almost inaudible scrape of skin on wet earth. The execution, swift and silent. When the moment came, the two lead men, armed only with silenced weapons and their knives, closed on the bunker entrance. The operation was over in less than 30 seconds. The designated target was swiftly subdued and gagged, and the primary sentry guarding the immediate area was neutralized, without firing a shot or making a sound that traveled beyond the immediate vicinity. The patrol then melted back into the jungle the way they came, dragging the subdued prisoner. The entire camp remained unaware of the intrusion until dawn, when the absence of the commander and the neutralized guard was discovered. This mission type became the ultimate proof of concept. The naked patrol wasn't simply a bizarre ritual. It was a highly effective tactical maneuver that married extreme personal sacrifice with devastating psychological impact. The success of these operations, achieved through hyper-stealth and courage, validated the willingness of these men to discard every protective layer in the pursuit of intelligence critical to the wider war effort. While the naked patrols were strategically successful, delivering intelligence and tactical victories achieved through unimaginable stealth, the cost borne by the individual troopers was profound both physically and psychologically. The mission did not end when the extraction helicopter lifted off. The real consequences began immediately afterward. Physical trauma, the price of exposure. The most immediate toll was the sheer physical trauma inflicted by direct, prolonged exposure to the jungle. While shedding the uniform solved the noise and friction problems, it exposed the skin to every biting, stinging, and cutting hazard imaginable. SAS troopers returning from these missions were often covered in multiple painful, infected wounds. Beyond the expected cuts and abrasions from pushing through thorny thickets, the exposure led to massive infestations of leeches, which, though largely painless when attached, caused significant blood loss, and left behind festering bites that were difficult to sterilize in the field. The prevention of fungal infections, tinea, by removing wet clothing was ironically replaced by the risk of widespread bacterial infections from the thick, polluted mud and water constantly coating their bodies. These men frequently spent weeks in recovery, dealing with the aftermath of severe skin conditions and systemic infections, a testament to the brutal trade-off they accepted for mission success. The psychological burden. Crossing the line, more subtle, but perhaps more lasting, was the psychological burden. These missions required the soldier to deliberately strip away every protective and identifying layer of their military identity. They had to transition from a highly trained, modern soldier into a near-elemental creature, silent, black, and operating on pure predatory instinct. This required an immense act of mental compartmentalization, pushing the boundaries of what they considered human conduct in warfare. For many, the sheer vulnerability and the extreme measures taken, such as the calculated use of psychological terror by embodying a spectre, were actions that sat uneasily with their professional training. While necessary, operating in a state of primitive exposure and intense, sustained fear often contributed to the complex post-traumatic stress experienced by Special Forces veterans. Silence and the ethical veil. The extreme nature of the naked patrols is one of the primary reasons these stories were kept so tightly within the SAS regiment and rarely emerged into the public consciousness. Firstly, the SAS has a culture of intense operational secrecy, but secondly, the conduct itself was highly unorthodox, revealing that elite Western troops were engaging in tactics that involved shedding clothing and using primitive camouflage to deliberately exploit cultural fears, risked negative public reaction and ethical scrutiny. The action was viewed as a necessary evil to achieve a mission deemed vital, but it was not a story military commanders were eager to publicize. Therefore, the stories of the Black Ghosts remained largely untold, existing only as whispers and grim acknowledgments among those who served. These veterans carried not only the physical scars of the jungle, but also the quiet knowledge of the lengths they went, to the lines they crossed, to fulfill the unique demands of special operations warfare in Vietnam.